November 1784, Thomas Coke arrived from England and met Francis Asbury at Barrett's Chapel in Delaware. The two men, both sent by John Wesley to establish Methodism in America, embraced and began to plan a gathering that would give birth to a new denomination. 1 month later, the Methodist Church in America was formally organized at Lovely Lane Chapel in Baltimore during the Christmas Conference of 1784. Among their actions, members of that body decreed that no clergy could own slaves. The founder of Methodism, John Wesley, a British Anglican priest, decried the inhumane system of slavery in which black people were treated as the property of their masters. They suffered brutal beatings, insults, denial of civil and human rights, and tragic separation from family members who were sold by their masters. The American Methodists ordained as their first bishop Francis Asbury, whom Wesley had sent from England. Harry Hoosier and Richard Allen, both popular preachers and former slaves, were there. But blacks had helped start the Methodist movement in colonial America 2 decades earlier. Ann Schweitzer, a slave, was a member of the First Methodist Society here, established in Maryland in 1764 by Robert Strawbridge, the first lay preacher in the colonies. Soon, thousands of black Methodist converts, both slave and free, were worshiping among whites in camp meetings and revivals, and their names began to appear on membership rolls. They responded to the impassioned songs and sermons of the Methodist movement and to the simple, unique message that divine grace was for all God's children, black and white, rich and poor, free and slave.
Somebody else has told you, you're nobody. Somebody has told you, you're a slave, you'll always be a slave. Somebody has told you that you were born to carry the water and for me to have my foot on your back. And here comes somebody saying, God loves you, God created you in God's own image, and you're a reflection of God, and God has accepted that you accepted, you're somebody, and it doth not yet appear what you shall be. My Lord.
Blacks were licensed by Methodists to preach to other blacks and occasionally to mixed congregations. However, they could not be ordained or administer sacraments. But these sons of thunder could preach powerfully, and they inspired thousands of their brothers and sisters to convert to Christianity and to join in this new denomination. There was Jacob Toogood of Maryland, believed to be the first black licensed preacher in American Methodism. There was Henry Evans in North Carolina, and John Stewart, who preached to the Indians in Ohio, and of course, the best-known black preacher, Harry Hoosier. This illiterate former slave from Maryland became one of the most eloquent and renowned preachers in America, drawing crowds and spreading the gospel from New England to the Carolinas.
I sing by faith, pray by faith, and do everything by faith. Without faith in Jesus Christ, I can do nothing.
Methodism flourished after 1784 as it moved from crowded homes and outdoor camp meeting sites into church buildings. But the growing number of exuberant black worshipers caused discomfort for some whites, especially as church sanctuaries overflowed. That led to racial discrimination, as blacks were forced to sit in balconies and take Holy Communion separately. Richard Allen led black members out of St. George's Church in Philadelphia in 1787 to start what became the African Methodist Episcopal Church. A similar break in New York led to the birth of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church.
Allen understood that these Methodists were saying one thing about who this God is and what grace means and so on, but they were practicing something else. But one of the things that Allen says when he leaves, I am glad I ever heard a Methodist preacher. I will always be a Methodist until I die.
Despite these departures, there was a remnant, a contingent of blacks who also left to form their own societies and churches, but were determined to remain within this denomination and seek justice and equality, no matter how long it would take. Thus, another group of blacks left St. George's Church in Philadelphia in 1794 and organized the African Zor Methodist Society in a nearby butcher's shop. 2 years later, they built a church and established the Zoar Congregation, the first and still the oldest among Black Methodists. Other groups of blacks left the galleries of mostly white churches to form their own Methodist societies and churches where they could meet and worship freely with dignity. They established Asbury and Mount Zion churches in Washington, D.C., Ezion Church in Wilmington, Union Church in Boston, and dozens of others across the Northeast region. Sharp Street Methodist Episcopal Church in Baltimore was established in 1802 by black members of Lovely Lane Chapel. It became not only a place of worship, but also a community center and a school, the first in Baltimore for black students. Today, it remains the second oldest black congregation in the denomination. These pioneering black congregations became mother churches as their members formed new societies and congregations in outlying communities where they lived. Together, these congregations would pay a heavy price for their determination to remain in communion with white Methodists. They would face nearly 2 centuries of racial prejudice and discrimination, as well as ridicule from those black Methodists who had left to form their own denominations. So why did they stay? Perhaps for the security and economic benefits to develop their churches and help their people. Or perhaps for the lofty ideal of a united multiracial church.
Blacks who remained within the Methodist Church experienced racism from whites and ridicule from blacks. In terms of their desire to worship with whites, they experienced segregation in the worship setting. They were relegated to seats in the rear, around the perimeter, and even in the balcony. When they aspired to the office of pastor, they discovered that they were not allowed to be licensed to preach. And when they were fortunate enough to organize their own local congregations, they discovered they did not have the authority to offer the sacrament of baptism nor Holy Communion. That task was given over to white pastors who came in and basically served as pastors of the local black congregations. And that was one of the things that they truly had to endure.
But this was their church too, and they clung to the hope that by staying they could one day change the hearts and habits of their white brothers and sisters. Sadly, that day would be a long time coming. After years of conflict and compromise over the prohibition against clergy owning slaves, the church finally split in 1844, creating the Methodist Episcopal Church South. It foreshadowed a larger split that would soon thrust the entire nation into a bloody civil war. While black Methodists were starting their own churches, they were still under the authority of white pastors. Eventually, they could be ordained as local deacons and elders, but they were tired of serving as mere helpers to the white pastors assigned to their churches. Black leaders continually petitioned the Methodist General Conference to allow them to control their own churches and organize their own regional conferences where they could manage their own affairs. While their petitions were being denied every 4 years by General Conference, they were losing members to their sister black denominations that enjoyed the benefits of self-determination. But in 1864, as slaves were being freed and the end of the Civil War was imminent, leaders of black churches met in Delaware, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and the Washington, D.C. area. Together, they petitioned General Conference once again. This time, their petition was approved. Black Methodists organized the Delaware Conference in July 1864 at John Wesley Church, now Tinley Temple, in Philadelphia. Then they organized the Washington Conference at Sharp Street Church in Baltimore on October 31st. One day later, on November 1st, the state of Maryland freed its 90,000 slaves, a year before President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation would become federal law. Bishop Levi Scott, presiding over the Washington Conference on that occasion, noted this coincidence in his closing remarks.
The beginning of this conference is small, it is true, but who can tell what by the blessing of God it may become? There is something, too, in the fact that the day on which the first annual conference of colored preachers of the Methodist Episcopal Church, ever held in the state of Maryland, closes, is the day on which the dominion of slavery ceases. 90,000 of your brethren will lie down tonight, if indeed they do lie down, with the manacles of slavery upon them. But when the midnight hour shall strike, even as the angel came and unloosed Peter, and he rose a free man, so shall their chains fall off, and these thousands shall rise to the dignity of free men. I exhort you to prove to the world your capacity for self-government and your worthiness of the great boon which God has so mercifully granted you.
8 Black mission conferences were organized in just 4 years, and they successfully pushed to gain full annual conference status and voting rights at General Conference. Nearly a dozen more would join them by the end of the century. The boundaries of the Washington Conference extended to the Chesapeake Bay, Washington, D.C., and parts of western Maryland, northern Virginia, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. The Delaware Conference stretched from southern Virginia up through eastern Maryland and Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey, and New York. The Delaware and Washington conferences conducted stewardship campaigns and developed a variety of mission enterprises, including boards of church extension to grow new churches, preachers' aid societies to help support pastors and their families, relief for orphans, and other ministries for the poor. The Washington Conference established the N.M. Carroll Home for the Aged in Baltimore in 1885 to serve the entire region. It continues to provide care for elderly residents with church support. And Morgan College, now state-owned Morgan University, emerged from Sharp Street Church's basement in 1867 as the Centenary Bible Institute. It was one of numerous schools and colleges founded by Methodist churches after the Civil War, because those churches knew that only through education could Black people develop as citizens, leaders, and entrepreneurs to claim their rightful place in society.
They came to believe that education was the key to success, not only in society, but as they sought to advance in the Christian church itself. As a result of that, all forms of schools, night schools, day schools, industrial schools, Sunday schools, even colleges and universities, were supported by Blacks, and whenever they had the opportunity to enroll, they stampeded to that opportunity. And Morgan College is an outstanding example of the support that Blacks gave to the emergence of colleges and universities within the Black community.
With Morgan College's help, the Delaware Conference established its training academy in Princess Anne County, Maryland, in 1884. Today, it is the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. Both conferences also spoke out against violence and injustices committed against Black people, especially in the South. Members called for federal action to stem the growing tide of lynching and repressive Jim Crow laws that systematically robbed Black citizens of their civil rights. In the meantime, they bid a fond farewell to a tremendous civil rights leader who was one of their own. Frederick Douglass, once a slave, had fought that evil institution as a free man through his powerful advocacy and leadership. But as a member of Sharp Street Church and a local preacher, he also helped in the crusade to gain annual conferences and other rights for Black Methodists. At his 1896 funeral, Douglass was extolled as the greatest Negro of the century and the greatest genius of his time. Charles Albert Tindley was equally great in Methodism for his tremendous contributions of music and ministry. Like Douglass, he was raised as a slave on Maryland's Eastern Shore, but he rose to prominence as a prolific and profound hymn writer, preacher, and pastor. In 1924, he led the building of what became Tindley Temple in Philadelphia, a cathedral and central meeting place for the Delaware Conference, and one of the largest and most active churches in the denomination. Methodism grew, but there was competition from the independent Black Methodist denominations, which now included the colored, or later Christian, Methodist Episcopal Church. They claimed superiority because the predominantly white Methodist denominations had no Black bishops or other Black leaders in the United States, only a few Black clergy, beginning with Francis Burns, who served as missionary bishops in Africa.
It made it difficult for Methodists to sell themselves when they could not do like African American Methodism or African American Methodist Zion or like Baptists or like Pentecostals and others who said, here is our leader, where is yours? And we had to point to whites for our leadership.
An estimated 1/4 of the Methodist Episcopal Church's black members transferred to the independent Black Methodist denominations, prompting the General Conference of 1872 to finally remove the official restriction against blacks being elected as bishops. Sadly, however, almost 50 more years would pass before the first black bishops would be elected to serve in the United States. Under great pressure, and despite white Southerners' opposition, the 1920 General Conference finally elected the first two U.S. black bishops, Matthew W. Clare and Robert E. Jones. They were appointed to serve 6 of the 13 black annual conferences.
The dilemma for white Methodism was that most of them did not want to be supervised by an African American bishop. That kept African American bishops from being elected. However, in 1916, that was changed, and bishops were now assigned to specific conferences and not just to the church at large. That meant it was okay then to assign and appoint bishops to a specific area that was all black.
For 2 decades, a commission on union considered proposals to unite the North and South Methodist Episcopal churches with the Methodist Protestant Church to create one denomination. Finally, a plan of union was offered in 1936 with the stipulation demanded by Southern whites that in addition to geographical jurisdictions, there must be a segregated central jurisdiction to include the Negro conferences. All 3 denominations approved the plan of union, and the churches united in 1939. Black annual conferences and black delegates to General Conference were the only group to vote against it. But the majority of blacks saw it as a humiliating, regressive, unchristian act of racial segregation that would make the Negro the sacrificial lamb on the altar of merger. Nonetheless, the all-black central jurisdiction convened its first quadrennial session in 1940 in St. Louis. It formed new committees, elected bishops, and replaced the existing Women's Missionary and Aid Societies with the new Women's Society of Christian Service and the new Wesleyan Service Guild. After 74 years of being led by white bishops, the Washington and Delaware conferences received 2 black bishops from 1940 to 1964. Bishops Alexander Preston Shaw and Edgar A. Love, both native to the area, served 12 years each, steering both conferences through periods of great challenge, opportunity, and change. Under Bishop Shaw, churches were just emerging from the Great Depression, heavily in debt and in dire need of repairs. Morgan College and the Princess Anne Academy were both taken over by the state of Maryland because the 2 black founding conferences could no longer afford to maintain these growing institutions on their own. The needs of congregations and their communities were changing. Unable to erect new buildings because of the industrial demands of the Second World War, many growing churches relocated to find better facilities, including rural churches that moved into the cities. The 1950s brought economic growth and more social change. As black populations moved into new areas, Bishop Love led the 2 conferences in raising funds to acquire new properties and build new churches. The Supreme Court outlawed segregation in public schools. Black clergy and laity began to make advances in higher education and new professions. Black and white church groups, youth and adults, started coming together interracially for meetings, training, and fellowship, laying the foundation for a new inclusive church. And more people, especially those active in the growing civil rights movement, began to question the church's racist status quo. One glaring part of that status quo was the meager salaries and pensions that made black ministers second-class citizens among Methodist clergy. Indeed, most were so poor when they retired that special offerings had to be taken on their behalf. After decades of efforts to remedy the problem, Bishop Love raised annuities for retirees by spearheading the creation of a reserve pension fund with conference and general church support. In the midst of this march toward justice and equality came the pivotal 1956 General Conference, where Black delegates presented the results of their comprehensive study on the central jurisdiction and called for its abolishment. On May 1st, the General Conference agreed. There must be no place in the Methodist Church for racial discrimination or enforced segregation, it said. We recommend that discrimination or segregation by any method or practice, whether in conference structure or otherwise, be abolished with reasonable speed. The next day, delegates approved Amendment 9, a plan for the orderly dismantling of the central jurisdiction.
The 1950s represents an interesting time in the life of the church because it was there that the attack was made upon segregation throughout the nation. The NAACP, for example, launched its attack against segregation in public education when it filed its first case in 1951 in the Brown versus Board of Education. 3 years later, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the NAACP when it declared the doctrine of separate but equal to be unconstitutional and declared that all public schools must desegregate. But with this attack upon education in the public arena, all eyes then began to cast itself upon the Methodist Church because of its policy of segregation vis-a-vis the central jurisdiction. And in 1956, the General Conference of the Methodist Church passed what was known as Amendment 9, which allowed Black annual conferences to transfer into white annual conferences. And it was then just a matter of time when the walls of segregation would fall.
That same General Conference approved two other long overdue pivotal measures. It mandated equal representation for laity and clergy at annual conferences, and it gave full and equal clergy rights to ordained clergywomen. Emma Burrell, a deacon in the Washington Conference, became the first Black woman in the Methodist Church to gain probationary conference membership in 1956. She later became a full member when she was ordained an elder in 1959. Amendment 9 called for the voluntary transfer of all central jurisdiction conferences, churches, and bishops into the predominantly white conferences and jurisdictions where they were located, after which the central jurisdiction would be abolished. It was a slow process, guided by the Committee of Five, that sought to ensure the end of not only the segregated jurisdiction, but all evidences of racial discrimination. A number of Black Methodist churches across the region and the country, like St. Mark's in New York City, were not a part of the central jurisdiction, and several, led by Mitchell Memorial in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, began transferring early into majority white conferences in the 1950s. But the Washington, Delaware, and Lexington conferences all voted to merge into majority white conferences and jurisdictions in 1964. The Delaware Conference at that time reportedly had more than 42,000 members and about 260 churches valued at over $13 million. The Washington Conference had more than 37,000 members and nearly 280 church buildings valued at over $12 million. There were also hundreds of parsonages and more than 100 ordained clergy in each conference. In 1965, both conferences transferred their congregations, properties, and personnel into the now racially integrated geographical conferences where they were located.
Many of the people of African American heritage could have left the church in that era between 1939 and 1965, and we didn't. We persevered, and I think that kind of loyalty and commitment, and you see it even unto today, we stick to it. And I think that's one of the gifts we brought, the gift of spirituality, our music, our belief, our faith. Those are things that we brought. Unless folk think that we didn't bring anything substantial, we did bring something substantial. We brought financial resources with us, we brought our churches, we brought our people, we brought important resources to the work of God in this area.
Although the last transfer of black conferences did not happen until 1973, the Central Jurisdiction came to an end in 1967 at its final session in Nashville, Tennessee. The next year, the United Methodist Church was born from the merger of the Methodist and Evangelical United Brethren churches with 5 geographical jurisdictions in the United States and conferences in Europe, Africa, and Asia. With merger and the birth of a new denomination came many other changes. Among them, the General Commission on Religion and Race was established to do racial monitoring, education, and advocacy. And Black Methodists for Church Renewal, a national caucus, was organized to represent the concerns of black churches in this new United Methodist Church.
The advantage to being in the Washington Conference for me was an environment where people cared about you, where people nurtured you, and where you had an opportunity to learn and to interact with the leaders in the conference. I knew the bishop, and I knew the district superintendent, and many young people, many people in the church didn't have that opportunity. But in addition to that, I had opportunity to go to various kinds of training experiences. Some of my fondest memories are of traveling by automobile with Evelyn Tymas and Levi Miller and other young people to conferences across the church. We went by auto because during those days, train travel was expensive and segregated, and of course, flying was not that available. And we went to as far as Kansas City to various kinds of training events. But I had an opportunity to learn how the church functions, not just in the annual conference, but beyond.
One of the key things that I believe the Delaware Conference brought to the Greater Connection is spirituality. It's undeniable in my mind how the worship experiences of the Old Delaware Conference that I experienced, how those experiences really meant so much to those individuals, how they undergirded pastors and laity. And I say those individuals, but even me as a youth in that conference at the time, because that was my basis of really being able to experience God and to experience the presence of God in a special way.
At least 7 black bishops emerged from the former Washington and Delaware conferences to serve throughout the Central Jurisdiction. But Bishop Prince Taylor, elected in 1964, became the first black bishop to lead a predominantly white conference when he was appointed to serve the New Jersey area. He later became the first black president of the Council of Bishops. And Bishop Roy Nichols, former pastor of Salem Church in Harlem, New York, became the first black bishop elected by the Northeastern Jurisdiction in 1968. Since then, more black Episcopal leaders have led and guided the development and ministries of the United Methodist Church in this pioneering jurisdiction.
At this point in history, the leadership of bishops is clearly multiracial and integrated. We no longer have to think about that anymore. I personally participate in the Council of Bishops in a renewed sense of vigor because we are no longer separated. We now are elected to committees, chair committees. In fact, presidents of the Council of Bishops have come out of African Americans, and every other department and agency in the church has had its head by African Americans. I, for instance, was head of the General Counsel and Finance Administration for 4 years. That's significant in our denomination, and it's present in all areas.
The many gifts and graces of this birthplace region of Methodism, gifts of leadership, loyalty, evangelistic growth, and social progress, stem in great measure from the legacy of black churches in and beyond the Delaware and Washington conferences. It is a legacy of fortitude, of fruitful ministry, and of lasting faith in the promises of Almighty God and in the redemptive triumph of our risen Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ.